Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to another podcast interview at the Idea to Value podcast. Very happy to have David Gluckman with us today. He's the author of That Shit Will Never Sell, and today we're going to be talking about one of everyone's favorite topics, alcohol. David, it's wonderful having you here.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So for people who don't know you or the work that you've done, can you give us a brief background as to your involvement with innovation and new products?
Okay, I started my career in advertising back in the 50s, came to the UK in 61 from South Africa, worked in advertising for 8 years and then drifted into product development almost by accident. Was lucky enough to meet a client who was in the drinks business, a company called IDV, which is now Diageo, and I worked for them for 36 years. I didn't know anything about innovation or product development when I started, but I had plenty of time to learn on the hoof.
And you've recently written this book, That Shit Will Never Sell. It's a pretty controversial title, but it's something that a lot of people end up hearing when they bring their ideas to senior management for approval. And that's one of the things we want to talk about today. It's this concept of how you convince people the value of trying out a new idea. So can you give us a background as to the story behind That Shit Will Never Sell?
Well, the story behind That Shit Will Never Sell was to do with Bailey's Irish Cream, which is a brand that I developed back in the early 70s. And I developed it with a team of very talented people because I just triggered off the idea. Other people made it work and made it happen. Bailey's came from experience I had in the early 60s working with Tony O'Reilly, who was at that time the head of the Irish Dairy Board. And the agency I worked with transformed Irish butter from a commodity which was used in blending to a brand which was called Kerrygold. And a decade later, I had this brief to develop a product from Ireland, an alcoholic beverage product from Ireland. And we asked the question, what happens if you mix Irish dairy produce with Irish whiskey? And the result was Bailey's.
Now, it seems like that's completely different to what had come beforehand. I assume Bailey's was the first product of its type on the market. That must have some advantages, but it must also have scared off a lot of people.
Well, bear in mind with brands like that, they take a long time to happen. Bailey's wasn't an overnight sensation. It took about 5 to 7 years before it really appeared as a major brand on a world stage. It wasn't an overnight success. So, but other people did follow it in. I think at one stage, 3 or 4 years in, there were 70-odd copies of Bailey's. And in fact, the wheel has turned completely full circle because I noticed recently that an American company had brought out Kerrygold Irish cream liqueur using the same kind of Bailey's packaging, squat brown bottle, pastoral scene on the label. So there's now Kerrygold Irish cream liqueur following Bailey's. Isn't that amazing?
And what is this concept of That Shit Will Never Sell? How does that fit in with the story of Bailey's?
Well, the top management at IDV took a couple of bottles of Bailey's over to the United States to check it out with some of the top people in the business over there. And one famous man looked at the bottle, said the labeling reminded him of Vietnam fatigues, tasted the product, looked up and said, "That shit will never sell." Seemed like a great title for a book.
But if someone so senior in a company dismisses the idea so vehemently, then how do you actually get it onto the market? Is that not just a big red stop sign?
I think he took it on. He was a pretty smart guy, and he took it on, and it became very successful in the US. I think the biggest selling liqueur in the US market. So those are first thoughts, I guess. And a lot of people were pretty snooty about Bailey's, even within the company. It wasn't fine wine. It wasn't malt whiskey. People out, I remember somebody at Bailey's the day we presented the idea. He hadn't been in the presentation, but I don't know how. He learned all about it. And he said to me in the men's room, it'll never work in the Irish market. But it just took bloody-minded people. I mean, the real hero of Bailey's was a man called David Dand, because David Dand was the man who went out and sold Bailey's across the world and persisted where others resisted. So he was a foot soldier and the man who ran the company, but he really was a great ambassador for it.
So let's take it into some advice for people who are trying to develop their own brands now. What sort of things can we talk about as far as what it takes to take an idea through whatever market research is needed to prove the idea and then finally out onto the market?
I think that in my experience, and I've been through a whole host of brand development experiences, it worked best when you were dealing with a single person who was very high up in the organization, and I mean very high up, international global board members, who knew about innovation, who knew about ideas. If you dealt with middle management, you spent huge amounts of money trying to make up your mind, and or for them to make up their mind. And I think in the defense of middle management, they don't have the power to make things happen. A guy called Tim Ambler, who was the global head of marketing at IDV, he could make things happen. He had access to budget. He had power in the organization, and he also had incredible judgment. He could pick up on an idea and run with it. And if it failed, well, he had no fear of failure, because you win some, you win some, you lose some.
And I think this fear of failure is why a lot of companies seem to try and get as much evidence before launching a product as possible, where they'll go out and try 4, 5, 6 iterations of packaging, of brand names, of flavors in the case of drinks. What's your view on this, of trying to go out there and fine-tune products in focus groups or things like that before actually launching them?
Well, the more sophisticated companies call it, we are consulting our consumer. The consumer is always right, which is complete nonsense, really. I mean, a consumer comes along to a focus group or sits in a cold town hall in Macclesfield on an October morning and passes judgment on something, but they don't really care about it. They come along, they get paid to attend a focus group, they get enticed to go into an interview, but I think it's a very flawed system. I mean, I worked in market research as far back as 1960, when it had barely been invented, and I've worked on researching my own brands for 40 years or so, and it's a very it's a very low in the food chain of sciences, I think. Market research, you can see this the way the polls have been discredited recently with the elections all over the place. It's not so big, market research. It's put on too high a pedestal.
So how do you approach the work that you do then, if you see these flaws in focus groups and market research?
Well, if your client really, really understands the problem and you really understand your client's problem, then you're in a good place to come up with a solution to a brief. And I then did go and do research, a couple of focus groups just to fine-tune, see if there's anything we missed. I remember we had a brand once called, it was the first Alcopop, or ready-to-drink, pre-mixed alcoholic drink. It was back in the 80s. And we had called it Prost, P-R-O-S-T, in order to give it some kind of beer signals. And I did a few groups on this, and it went perfectly. Everybody said it was fine. And then one woman stood up and said, I couldn't imagine going up to a bar and asking for a bottle of Prost. So I said, well, why not? She said, well, it reminds me of prostitutes and prostates. And as soon as she said it, and she was the only person who did, I thought, God, you're absolutely right. And we changed the name the next day to St. Leger. I can't remember why we called it St. Leger, but it was no longer Prost. Because of 3.125% of our sample, one woman said it, but she was right. And you have to know that she's right. You have to feel that she's right. And if it's your brand and you're testing it, you're in that position to do that.
But how do you know when an idea is right in that case? Because as you said, if this one woman said that she didn't like the name, then 96.5% of people said they had no problem with the name, and surely that's the majority of people. Doesn't that indicate that you were right in the first place?
No, I think you have to make a call. You just have to make a call. And once you make that call, I have another example of a brand which was, there was no money for the brand. It was a whiskey. It was a cheap whiskey to sell in Europe to compete with brands like VAT 69, which were below the Johnny Walker Red Label, J&B, Ballantine's tier. And there was no money to develop the brand, so we could give it no credentials at all. So I said, well, look, these products sell in hypermarkets in Spain. And the most important thing in a hypermarket in Spain is to be noticed. So why don't we produce a whiskey in a bottle with a purple label, a metallic purple label? And we called it Spey Royal. And people did quite a lot of research on it, and respondents said, well, whiskey doesn't come in bottles with purple labels. So, what do you do? What happened, which is a lovely story, was it bombed in Europe. Nobody took it on. The two guys from Thailand saw it. Purple is the imperial color in Thailand, as I'm sure you know. And they made it into one of the biggest selling brands in Thailand. They both made millions. And it's a great story.
So my question is, when you're developing something yourself, then you've got all the insights on what you believe about the product and why it might succeed, why the sort of things that other people might miss. But at the same time, when you go out and you test it out with people, you might get some new insights that you'd never even thought about, which will fundamentally change the way you see your own product. There must be a fine balance in between trusting your gut and your own instincts and taking on board the external feedback and changing it.
Well, I don't think it's trusting your gut. I think it's trusting your experience and judgment and the experience and judgment of your client. I mean, if somebody gives me a job to do, they are employing me as an expert, not as some person who's going to flash a whole lot of hypotheses and say, I don't know which is the answer, but we will find a way. The best work is a dialogue between the briefer and the creator, the client and the producer. And when you both understand what you're doing, then you go ahead and do it. I mean, I can't remember any real failures, except when they failed through messing things up politically, which is very important.
What do you mean by messing things up politically?
I did an Australian white rum to compete with Bacardi back in the 80s. And the idea was that we wanted to develop a masculine white rum, a macho white rum. And I looked around the world for a place which wasn't like Bacardi land, which was every island with palm trees. And I hit on Australia. So we produced a drier tasting, higher strength rum from Australia called Stubbs, in the book. And it was a terrific idea. It was not made from sticky, gooey molasses, but from fresh cane juice. And it was a fabulous product and a really good brand. But we made two fundamental mistakes. One, we developed it without consulting the Australian company, which is a terrible mistake, because if you do that, you alienate them completely. And secondly, we did it without involving and getting the buy-in of the American company. So it doesn't matter how good the brand was, it was never going to work because there wasn't commitment. And I think that's also pretty important.
I think it goes back to what you said about having the people at the decision-making level on board to start with, because it's very hard to convince someone after you've already done something that it was a good idea to do. But if they're involved from the start, then they're much more likely to have the buy-in to see it succeed.
That's absolutely right. And I mean, I think there was a nice case with Bailey's. We originally had called Bailey's a chocolate cream liqueur. And the Irish, when they took over the brand, said, no, we're just going to call it an Irish cream liqueur. And I won't say I was up in arms about it, but I was slightly miffed because they were starting to change our lovely creation. But if you think about it, they were beginning to take ownership of the idea, and which was extremely important. I mean, if there had been some way in which I could have forced them to call it chocolate liqueur, they would have been antagonized and they might not have put as much commitment. So it's very much a question of up and down and, bargaining and allowing people to run with the brand. Once you've had an idea, other people will run with it. And an example that I was quite interested in, where the running with it was infinitely more successful than the creation, was a brand called Cîroc. Do you know Cîroc?
Is that the one by Puff Daddy?
Exactly. Well, the thing about Cîroc, which my contribution to that was, I said, why don't we produce vodka made from grapes, not from grain? I mean, most vodka, people believe it's made from potatoes, but most vodka is made from grain. And this is going back to the turn of the 2000s. The company were looking for a brand to compete with Grey Goose, which was doing incredibly well. And I said, well, in order to compete with Grey Goose, we have to come up with something that's perceptibly different. In other words, it's not just a sexy image and a nice pack, and came up with the idea of producing grape vodka, which had not been done before. And then Puff Daddy came along and made it into a mega success, which was way beyond my pay grade.
One thing which we talked about before we started the interview was an interesting concept, I thought. It's this idea that you go into a project with no plan B. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think if you're going to be true to your skill, then if somebody asks you to develop an idea, you develop an idea. As soon as you develop more than one, your level of certainty diminishes. If you say to me, I want you to do something for me, and I come back and say, well, look, here are 6 things you could do, I'm not being true to my skill, if you like. I'm paid to come up with a solution, not six solutions or 16 solutions, because 16 solutions are really easy. One solution is the challenge.
Do you sometimes think that the reason companies feel that it's more beneficial to think of 5, 10, 16 solutions before making a decision is that it reduces the risk, but it also reduces the risk on whoever makes the final decision. So it becomes more of a communal failure if it does fail.
Well, you can say market research said it would be successful. I've written a piece on LinkedIn about 3 brands where enormous amounts of money was spent on research. One was Guinness Light, which launched, and which I had something to do with in the post-mortem rather than developing the brand. But they developed a brand called Guinness Light in Ireland in the 70s. They gave it huge hype. They rode on the back of the success of Miller Lite in the US, and it was a complete disaster, utter disaster. And the reason it was a disaster was that they omitted to ask the most important people, the other people in the pub who wouldn't be drinking it. I remember one young guy came in and said, I walked into this bar and it was festooned with Guinness Light material. There were posters and special glasses and pennants and drip mats and everything. So I tried it, and as I put the glass to my lips, a hand tapped me on the back, and it was a guy in his 40s, and he said, drinking ladies Guinness, are we? And that absolutely killed it. And the ads had Armstrong on the moon and voiceover saying, they said it couldn't be done. And that was the story there. I think that people have this mantra that says, let the consumer decide. So you take 5 ideas and you go out and you show them to consumers. And most often consumers pick the ideas that are closest to what they know. You know, consumers don't know what they like, but they do like what they know. So you get something that's very close to home. So you never get innovation, you never get a breakout from where you are. And I'm afraid I think we're back in the age of judgment rather than in the age of research. Research is not a device that will solve all your problems. It's been proved more often than not to be wrong. So you have to go with what you believe and what you know.
David, it's been wonderful speaking with you. Unfortunately, we're coming up to the end of the interview now. I know you've probably got a lot more examples in your book about how people can learn about both the successes and the failures of new product development. Can you tell us where people can go to find out more about your work and the book?
Well, I've been writing a lot on LinkedIn recently. I've written eight or 9 essays, postings, so they can have a look at that. The book is only available online, and the way to buy it is www.stopthatshitwillneversell.com. And I hope people will buy it. And thank you for your indulgence.
And thank you for joining us. It's been wonderful, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Okay.
Today's episode was made possible by members of our premium Deep Creativity Training Program. For less than the price of half a candy bar per day, you too can get world-exclusive daily exercises which push your creativity past its comfort barrier to make you better able to generate ideas in all aspects of your life and work. Invest in yourself now by going to www.ideatovalue.com/deepcreativity and using coupon code PODCAST for 25% off your first order. And don't forget that if you found this episode interesting, to like and share it, and to leave us a review in your favorite podcast player. See you again in the next episode.